What happens to the families of history's most infamous men once the guns fall silent? Hermann Göring, Hitler's second-in-command and head of the Luftwaffe, stood at the very top of the Nazi hierarchy. We know his fate after Nuremberg. But what about his wife, his beloved daughter, and the rest of his family? Were they punished? Did they vanish into obscurity? Or did they quietly rebuild their lives after the Third Reich's collapse? Today, we'll uncover the remarkable and little-known story of Göring's family after 1945. When the Third Reich collapsed in May 1945, Hermann Göring's name was already infamous across the world. As Reichsmarschall, head of the Luftwaffe, and one of Hitler's closest confidants, he had risen higher than almost anyone else in Nazi Germany. But as the Allies closed in, his family's lives were torn apart, just as surely as Germany itself. To understand what happened to them, we need to look closely at the fate of his wife, Emmy Goring, his daughter, Edda, and his extended relatives who bore the burden of his name. Let's start with Emmy Goring, Hermann's wife. Born Emmy Sonnemann, she had been a successful stage actress before marrying Göring in 1935. Their marriage was a glamorous affair, attended by Hitler himself. Emmy became a sort of First Lady of the Luftwaffe, known for her beauty, charm, and presence at official functions. But when Germany fell in 1945, her glamorous world crumbled in an instant. After the war, Emmy was arrested by American forces. Unlike her husband, who faced the Nuremberg trials, Emmy was not considered a central figure of the Nazi regime. Still, her status as Göring's wife meant she was placed under investigation. The Allies held her for over a year before a denazification tribunal tried her in 1948. The tribunal classified her as a lesser offender. This meant she wasn't accused of war crimes, but was found guilty of benefiting from the Nazi regime. Her punishment was mild compared to others. She was forbidden from the stage for several years and had much of her wealth confiscated. She had lived in luxury during the Third Reich, in mansions filled with stolen art and treasures, but by the late 1940s, she had been reduced to a modest life. For Emmy, survival after the war meant raising her daughter, Edda, in an environment where the Göring name carried enormous stigma. Let's focus now on that daughter, because her story is even more fascinating. Edda Goring was born in 1938, the princess of the Nazi elite. Hitler himself was her godfather. During the war, she lived in privilege, shielded from the horrors unfolding around her. But when the Allies captured her father in May 1945, Edda's childhood ended abruptly. She was only 7 years old when her father stood trial at Nuremberg. Hermann Göring's trial was one of the most publicized events of the 20th century. Edda never saw him again after 1945. He was sentenced to death, but famously cheated the hangman by swallowing cyanide in his cell on October 15, 1946. For Edda, it was the defining event of her life. She later recalled the crushing weight of being Hermann Göring's daughter. Every schoolmate, every neighbor knew the name. It was impossible to escape. Despite this, Edda grew up with fierce loyalty to her father. Even as an adult, long after the world had condemned him as a war criminal, she continued to defend his reputation. She insisted that he had been unfairly judged, that he had been a man of honor, and she never wavered from that position. Her childhood after the war was difficult. Emmy struggled to provide for her. They lived in relative poverty, surviving on small pensions and odd jobs. Yet Edda managed to build a life for herself. She studied law in Munich, and later worked as a nurse and medical assistant. Unlike other Nazi children who tried to change their names, she never hid who she was. In fact, she wore it openly. This stubborn pride earned her both admiration and scorn. What's especially striking is that Edda didn't simply fade into obscurity. She remained somewhat active in public life, though always quietly. She was known to attend veterans' gatherings, particularly among Luftwaffe veterans, where her father was still remembered with a certain twisted reverence. She never married, and had no children. Some suggest she chose this deliberately, unwilling to pass on the Göring name to another generation. She died in December 2018, at the age of 80, still unrepentant about her father's legacy. Now let's step back and ask, what about Göring's wider family? Unlike the Himmlers or the Goebbels, Göring had relatives who survived the war and tried to move on with their lives. Hermann had a younger brother, Albert Göring, whose story is one of the most surprising of the post-war era. Albert was the polar opposite of Hermann. Where Hermann embraced the Nazi regime, Albert despised it. He lived in Vienna during the 1930s and became known for helping Jews and political dissidents escape persecution. In fact, Albert used the Göring name as a shield. He would sign documents or make calls claiming to act on behalf of his brother, intimidating Nazis into freeing prisoners or halting deportations. His acts of quiet defiance saved dozens, perhaps hundreds of lives. Yet after the war, Albert was arrested simply because of his last name. The Allies couldn't believe that the brother of Hermann Göring could be innocent. He spent time in prison, under suspicion of being a collaborator, until those he had saved came forward to testify on his behalf. Eventually, he was released, but his life never recovered. He lived in poverty, working odd jobs, and died in 1966, almost forgotten. Only later was his story properly recognized. Today, Albert is remembered as the Good Göring, a rare example of decency in a family name otherwise steeped in blood. So, we have Hermann executed by his own hand in 1946, Emmy stripped of wealth and banned from her stage career, Edda growing up fiercely loyal to her disgraced father, and Albert the unlikely savior of Jews and anti-Nazis. But the story doesn't end there. One of the more overlooked aspects of Emmy and Edda's post-war life was their struggle with property and inheritance. The Göring estate had been vast, castles, mansions, and art looted from across Europe. After the war, the Allies confiscated most of it. Yet Emmy spent decades filing lawsuits, trying to recover parts of the property, especially art pieces. She claimed some items were family possessions rather than stolen goods. Most of these cases failed, but a few minor restitutions were granted. For Edda, the fight continued into her adult life. She too pursued legal claims, particularly over items in museums that had once belonged to her father. German courts, however, consistently ruled against her. These legal battles stretched into the 1990s and 2000s, long after most people had forgotten about the Göring family. Emmy herself lived a quiet existence in Munich after her release. She raised Edda, kept largely to herself, and never remarried. She died in 1973, at the age of 71. By then, she was a faded figure from a darker time, remembered mostly as the glamorous companion of a man who helped plunge the world into chaos. For historians, the Göring family represents the strange duality of Nazi legacies. On the one hand, Hermann Göring was a central architect of the war and the Holocaust, a man who profited enormously from plunder and death. On the other hand, his brother Albert risked his life to oppose that very system. Emmy and Edda, meanwhile, show us how deeply family loyalty can endure, even when the world condemns it. Perhaps the most haunting part of this story is Edda's refusal to reject her father. Many children of Nazi leaders, like Gudrun Himmler or the children of Joseph Goebbels, were consumed by the burden of their parents' crimes. Some cut ties with the past, others carried on the torch of denial. Edda stood firmly in the latter camp. For her, Hermann Göring remained a hero, not a criminal. To the very end of her life, she spoke of him with admiration. In the end, the fate of Göring's family shows us the complexity of history's aftermath. The fall of Nazi Germany didn't just destroy a nation. It shattered families, reputations, and legacies. Some rebuilt, some denied, some were forgotten, but all bore scars that never fully healed. So, what happened to Hermann Göring's family after World War II? His wife Emmy lived quietly after her conviction, stripped of her stage career and wealth. His daughter Edda grew up under the shadow of his name, fiercely loyal to her father until her death in 2018. And his brother Albert, almost forgotten, spent his life in poverty despite having saved lives during the war. The Göring family's story is a reminder that even after the Reich fell, its shadow lived on, in courtrooms, in memories, and in the unshakable weight of a name. Now, I want to hear from you. Did you already know about the fate of Göring's family, or did any part of this story surprise you? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into the untold stories of World War II.